The gun was already pressed against Ruth Keating's temple when Stephen Wallace rode into Caldwell, Kansas, and the sight of it nearly stopped his heart cold. He had been riding for 3 days straight, through dust storms and creek crossings that nearly swallowed his horse whole, following a trail of rumors and a single torn letter that had found its way into his hands by nothing short of providence. And now here he was, arriving too late, or perhaps not late enough, because Ruth was still breathing, still standing, her dark hair whipping across her pale face in the October wind, and the man holding the gun to her head was Harlan Cross, the very man who had brought her to Kansas in the first place. "You are going to sign the deed over," Harlan said, his voice low and reptilian, the kind of voice that slithered into a room before its owner did. "Or I am going to decorate this street with something considerably less pretty than your stubbornness." Ruth did not flinch. That was the thing that broke Stephen open even before he fully understood what he was seeing. She did not flinch. Her eyes were locked straight ahead, her jaw set like iron, and her hands, bound at the wrists with rough rope, were perfectly still. She was terrified. He could see that in the slight tremor of her lower lip, but she refused to let Harlan Cross see it. "You will not get that deed," Ruth said quietly, and her voice did not shake even once. "Not while I am standing." "That," Harlan said, pressing the barrel harder, "is rather the point, Miss Keating." Stephen's hand moved to his holster before his mind caught up to his body. Every man on that street had gone very still. The blacksmith had stopped mid-swing. The woman hanging laundry 2 buildings down had frozen with a sheet still in her hands. The whole dusty tableau of Caldwell, Kansas, in the fall of 1873, had locked itself into a single suspended breath, waiting to see what would happen next. And Stephen Wallace, a man who had ridden into this town 2 months ago with nothing but a saddlebag full of surveying equipment and no intention whatsoever of falling in love, pulled his revolver and said, in the steadiest voice he had ever managed in his 31 years of living, "Harlan Cross, step away from that woman." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Ruth had ever heard. She had not known Stephen Wallace was coming for her. She had not known anyone was coming for her. And the sight of him there, tall and sun-darkened and breathing hard from a long ride, his gray eyes fixed on Harlan with an expression that was somewhere between fury and devastation, undid something in her chest that she had been working very hard to keep fastened shut. She had met him 8 weeks ago, under circumstances so different from this one that they almost felt like a story she had invented. It had been August, and the heat in Caldwell had been the kind that made the air itself look liquid. Ruth had arrived on the noon stage from Wichita, stepping down onto the main street with a carpetbag in one hand and a letter of employment in the other, squinting against the relentless Kansas sun, and feeling, for the first time in a long while, something that might have been hope. She had come west for reasons she did not share easily. Back in Ohio, where she had spent the first 26 years of her life, there had been a situation. Her father's land, 300 acres of decent farmland that had belonged to the Keating family since before the war, had become the subject of a dispute that Ruth had been fighting for 2 years after her father's death. The lawyers in Cleveland had told her with their careful, condescending patience that her options were limited, that a woman alone could not effectively contest the claim that Harlan Cross, a creditor and businessman of considerable local influence, had placed on the Keating estate. Ruth had not agreed with the lawyers. She had written letters. She had petitioned. She had sat in offices that smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather, and made her case with the kind of methodical precision that consistently surprised the men on the other side of the desk, and consistently failed to move them. Because in 1873, being right and being a woman were frequently 2 things that canceled each other out. And then Harlan Cross himself had appeared with a proposition. He had a cattle operation in Kansas, he explained, large and growing. He needed a bookkeeper, someone with education and intelligence, someone who could manage the financial records of an operation that was becoming too complex for rough cowboys with limited arithmetic. He had heard, through his various connections, that Ruth Keating was precisely such a person. And he would be willing, he said, to reconsider the matter of the Ohio property if she would agree to come west and take the position. Ruth had not trusted him for a single second. But she had needed options, and Harlan Cross was the only one on offer, and so she had come to Caldwell, Kansas, with her carpetbag and her letter and her eyes open as wide as she could keep them. The cattle operation was real. The bookkeeping position was real. What Harlan Cross had not mentioned was that he also intended Ruth to serve as a kind of social ornament, appearing on his arm at dinners and cattle auctions, lending the respectability of an educated Eastern woman to his ambitions of legitimate business standing in the territory. And what he had further neglected to mention was that the Ohio property dispute had not been a simple debt collection matter at all. Ruth had discovered this through the ledgers. She was very good at ledgers. She had taught herself debentry bookkeeping from a manual at the age of 14, had managed her father's accounts from 17 onward, and had a mind that naturally saw patterns in numbers the way some people see faces in clouds. It was second nature to her, unavoidable, and so when she sat down with Harlan Cross's financial records for the first time, she began to notice things. Discrepancies at first, small ones. Amounts that did not quite balance, payments to names she could not identify, expenses categorized in ways that did not add up to what they claimed to be. She noted them carefully and said nothing, because she was smart enough to know that saying something too soon was how a person ended up in trouble. She was in Caldwell for 11 days before she met Stephen Wallace. He came into the Cross Operations small office, which was attached to the main building that served as both warehouse and occasional dining hall for Harlan's permanent employees, on a Tuesday morning in August. He was carrying a leather case of surveying instruments and looking for the man who had allegedly hired him to survey the eastern boundary of the Cross property, a task that had apparently been contracted and then forgotten about in the chaos of the cattle season. Ruth was alone in the office, working through a column of figures with a fine-tipped pen, when he knocked on the open door and said, "Excuse me, I am looking for the land manager. I was told I might find him here." She looked up. He was tall, with the kind of build that came from outdoor work rather than deliberate exercise, and he had gray eyes that she noticed immediately because they were unusual in a face that was otherwise very much that of a working man. He was dusty from the road, and he held his hat in his hands, and he looked at her with straightforward, respectful attention, not the evaluating look she was used to receiving from men who assumed that a young woman in an office was there primarily to be decorative. "Mr. Cross is not here," she said. "I am Ruth Keating. I manage the financial records. Is there something I can help you with?" He told her his name and his business. She told him that the land manager, a man named Potts, would be back before noon, and offered him a chair. He sat down, and she went back to her figures, and there was a silence between them that was, she realized somewhat to her surprise, entirely comfortable. "You are not from Kansas," he said after a few minutes. "Ohio," she said, "and you are not either." "Missouri originally," he said, "though I have been moving west for about 4 years now. Surveying land." "Surveying land," he agreed. "It is honest work and it takes me places. I find I prefer places." She looked up at him again then, and something in the way he said it, the lack of performance in it, the simple plainness of a man describing himself without embellishment, made her set her pen down. "I find I prefer them too," she said, "though I seem to have arrived at this particular one under complicated circumstances." She did not know why she said that. She was not a woman who shared complicated circumstances with strangers, but there was something about Stephen Wallace, even then, in those first 10 minutes of knowing him, that made honesty feel less dangerous than it usually did. He had looked at her with those gray eyes and said, "Most interesting places are arrived at that way," and she had felt something move in her chest that she immediately and firmly told herself to disregard. He did not leave when Potts arrived. He completed his business with the land manager, a transaction that took about 20 minutes, and involved a dispute about the boundary line that Stephen settled with quiet authority and a very detailed map he produced from his leather case, and then he lingered in the doorway afterward, turning his hat in his hands again. "Miss Keating," he said, "would you consider joining me for supper this evening? There is a decent dining establishment on the main street, I have been told. I find I rarely have good conversation with my meals, and I suspect you might provide some." It was a completely proper invitation. Earnest and a little awkward, and entirely lacking in the kind of practiced charm that Ruth had learned to distrust. She said yes before she had fully thought it through. Supper became a habit. Not every night, because neither of them had the leisure for that, and because Ruth was careful, instinctively careful, about being seen spending too much time with any man while she was employed by Harlan Cross, whose controlling interest in her life she was already beginning to resent. But 3 or 4 times a week, she and Stephen Wallace sat across a table from each other in the little dining room of the Caldwell Hotel, and they talked. They talked about everything. About Ohio and Missouri, about the mathematics of surveying and the mathematics of accounting, about books they had read, about the war that had ended 8 years ago and still lived in the bodies and silences of so many men in the West, about what the plains looked like in different lights, about whether Kansas would ever become a place where people could build something that lasted. Stephen had fought in the war. Union from Missouri, which had made him politically complicated in his home state and had eventually contributed to his decision to move on. He spoke of it carefully, not with the bravado some men used to turn horror into a kind of currency, but with the honest heaviness of someone who had seen things he would carry forever and had made peace with carrying them, even if the peace was imperfect and ongoing. Ruth had lost a brother to the war. Her older brother Daniel, who had been the funniest and most reckless member of the Keating family, had died at Chickamauga in 1863. She rarely spoke of it because the grief had long since moved from acute to chronic, the kind that lived in the background of everything rather than the foreground. But she found herself telling Stephen about Daniel one evening in early September, over coffee and a piece of apple pie that was better than she had expected from a Kansas frontier hotel. And she discovered that talking about him felt less like reopening a wound and more like setting something down she had been carrying. Stephen listened. That was the thing about him that she kept returning to, kept measuring against her growing awareness that she was in danger of caring about him more than was safe or sensible. He listened in a way that was active and present, not waiting for his turn to speak, genuinely attending to what she said, and then responding to what she had actually said rather than to some version of it that was more convenient for him. She had not encountered that very often, particularly not in men. Meanwhile, the ledgers continued to reveal their secrets. By mid-September, Ruth had assembled enough of the picture to understand what Harlan Cross's operation actually was. The cattle business was legitimate at its surface, but it was a surface laid over something considerably darker. Harlan was engaged in a scheme involving fraudulent land claims, using the Cross operation's financial muscle and legal connections to pressure smaller landowners in the region into selling at prices far below value, then reselling those same parcels to railroad interests at enormous profit. The names in his ledgers that she had not been able to identify were front companies, paper entities created specifically to obscure the movement of money. And the Ohio property, her father's land, was part of it. The debt that Harlan had cited as justification for his claim on the Keating estate had been manufactured. She found the evidence in a series of payments that, when traced carefully through 3 separate sets of books that Harlan kept in different locations within the office, resolved into a clear record of fabrication. There had been no debt. Her father had owed Harlan Cross nothing. The entire claim was a fiction designed to acquire Keating land at zero cost, land that sat along a route that the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad was actively considering for its expansion. Ruth sat with this knowledge for 3 days before deciding what to do with it. She could not simply confront Harlan. She understood that clearly. Harlan Cross was a man with lawyers and guns and money, and the kind of embedded local influence that made direct confrontation not just futile but actively dangerous. She could not go to the local sheriff, a man named Tidwell who she had observed at 2 of Harlan's dinners, and whose behavior suggested he was not operating independently of his host's interests. She could not go back to Ohio because she had no money for the journey and because leaving would mean abandoning the documentary evidence she had found, evidence she was now methodically and secretly copying. What she did was tell Stephen. She had not planned to. She had been sitting with the decision of whether to trust him, weighing it carefully, because she was not a woman who trusted easily, and she knew that her attraction to him was a factor that could cloud her judgment. But one evening in late September, when they were walking back from supper along the main street, and the stars over Kansas were the kind of brilliant that only happened in places where there were no other lights to compete with them, she found herself simply telling him. She laid it out the way she laid out a set of accounts, clearly in order, with the evidence presented logically and the conclusions following from it. And when she was done, Stephen Wallace stopped walking and turned to look at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. It was anger, but not at her. "How long have you known this?" he asked. "I have had most of it for 3 weeks," she said. "I wanted to be certain before I said anything." "Are you in danger?" She had thought about that. "Not yet," she said. "He does not know what I have found, but if he discovers that I have been copying the secondary ledgers, yes, almost certainly." Stephen was quiet for a long moment. The street was mostly empty, and a coyote was calling somewhere out beyond the edge of town, and the wind moved through Caldwell with the early autumn chill that reminded her how quickly the plains could change. "I know a federal land agent," Stephen said finally. "He works out of Wichita. I have done surveying work for the Federal Land Office, and I have met him several times. His name is Carver, and he is honest, which is not a thing you can say about everyone in that office, but I believe it about him." "That is exactly what I need," Ruth said. "Someone with federal authority who is not in Harlan's pocket." "I can ride to Wichita," Stephen said. "I can be there and back in 5 days if I push." She had looked at him then, this man she had known for 6 weeks, who was offering to ride 100 miles through Kansas plains to help her because she had told him a true thing and he had believed her without question and immediately turned toward action. "Why would you do that?" she asked. And she was not being rhetorical or coy. She genuinely wanted to understand. He met her eyes in the starlight and said, "Because what is happening to you is wrong. And because I find I am not able to be a bystander to that." He paused. "And because you matter to me, Miss Keating. Considerably more than I have probably made clear, and considerably more than I am entirely comfortable with, given how recently we have met." Ruth felt something shift in her chest with such force that it was almost physical. She stood very still on that empty street and looked at him and understood, with the same clarity with which she had understood the ledgers, that she was entirely, irrevocably in love with Stephen Wallace. She did not say that. She said, "I matter to you." "Yes," he said simply. "Then I suppose," she said carefully, "that I should tell you that the feeling is not unreciprocated." Something moved across his face that was, she thought, the most honest expression she had ever seen on anyone. It was not triumph or relief. It was something quieter and more serious than either of those, something that looked like a man who had been carrying a hope without letting himself fully feel it, suddenly finding out that the hope was allowed. He reached out and took her hand, there on the street in the October wind, and held it for a moment in both of his, and that was all. It was enough. It was, in fact, considerably more than enough. He rode to Wichita the next morning. While he was gone, things began to move faster than Ruth had anticipated. Harlan Cross returned from a 3-day trip to a cattle auction in Abilene with the disposition of a man who had not gotten everything he wanted, and he set about reviewing the office records with a thoroughness that he rarely applied to the day-to-day books. Ruth watched him from the corner of her eye and kept her face entirely still, and continued her work with the steady consistency of someone who had nothing to hide. But Harlan was not stupid. That was the thing she could never afford to forget. He was dishonest and ruthless, and he had a casual cruelty that he deployed with the indifference of someone who had never once suffered consequences for it. But he was not stupid. He had built something substantial through a combination of intelligence and willingness to do what other men would not, and that combination, in a man without conscience, made him genuinely dangerous. He began to watch her. She felt it before she could prove it, that particular quality of attention from someone who is assessing rather than simply observing. He was pleasant at dinner, attentive in the office, asking her questions about the cattle operations finances, with the manner of a man who was genuinely curious about the details of his own business. She answered everything directly and completely, giving him exactly what the surface books showed, which was perfectly clean and properly balanced, because Ruth had been meticulous about never disturbing the primary records. But on the fourth night after Stephen's departure, she came into the office in the early morning, before the rest of the household was awake, to retrieve a copy she had made of a particularly damning set of payment records, and she found that the loose floor plank she had been using as a hiding place had been moved. Her copies were gone. She stood in the empty office in the gray pre-dawn light and made herself breathe carefully and think clearly, because panic was the most expensive indulgence available to her right now, and she could not afford it. Someone had found her hiding place. That meant either someone had been watching her closely enough to observe where she went in the early mornings, or someone had searched the office systematically until they found it. Either possibility meant that her situation had just become considerably more dangerous. She went back to her room. She locked the door, for what small comfort that provided, and sat on the edge of her bed and thought about what she had, what she knew, and what she could do. She still had the copies she had sent with Stephen to Wichita. That was the important thing. She had been careful enough to give him copies of the most critical documents before he left, understanding even then that having everything in one location was a vulnerability. So the evidence still existed in the hands of someone she trusted on its way to a federal land agent. What she did not have was time. Harlan now knew, or strongly suspected, that she had been copying his records. Whatever calculated patience he might have extended to her was likely gone, and Stephen would not be back for at least another day, possibly two. She was considering her limited options when she heard the knock at her door. It was Harlan. He was dressed and shaved and carrying 2 cups of coffee, and he smiled at her with the pleasant, businesslike smile that she had learned to read as a mask over whatever he was actually calculating, and said, "Miss Keating, I apologize for the early hour. Might I have a word?" She stepped back from the door and let him in, because refusing entry to her employer in his own establishment was not a viable option, and she needed whatever time she had to understand what he knew and what he was planning to do about it. He set the coffee cups on her small table and sat down in the room's single chair with the comfortable authority of a man who owned the furniture and wanted her to remember it. "I have been reviewing the books," he said, conversationally. "You do excellent work, Miss Keating. The records are impeccable." "Thank you," she said. "I noticed, however," he continued, still in the same pleasant tone, "that you have also been reviewing some records that are not, strictly speaking, part of your position." She said nothing. "I am not angry," he said. "I want to make that clear. I think you are a very intelligent woman who has done what an intelligent woman in your position would naturally do, which is try to understand the full picture of the situation she has found herself in. I respect that, actually." "Then you will understand," Ruth said quietly, "why I am not going to pretend that I don't know what I know." Something moved behind his eyes, not anger, not yet, something colder. "What I hope," he said, "is that you will understand the wisdom of making decisions that serve your interests, which I would suggest currently involve staying here, continuing your work, and forgetting about whatever it is you think you found. And my father's land," she said, he tilted his head, "a complicated matter." "It is not complicated at all," Ruth said. "The debt was false. You fabricated it. I have the records that prove it." The pleasant smile went away completely. They looked at each other across the small room for a long, tightly wound moment. "Where are those records now?" he asked. "Somewhere safe," she said, and that was all she said. What followed were the worst 2 days of Ruth Keating's life. Harlan did not hurt her, not physically, not yet. But he made it very clear that she was not to leave the Cross property, that the horses in the stable were not available to her, and that the 2 men he stationed near the building's exits were not there for her protection. She was, in everything but legal language, a prisoner. She could not get a message out. She tried through the cook, a quiet woman named Marta who seemed sympathetic. But Harlan had clearly anticipated this, and Marta came back to her with frightened eyes and shaking hands and said she was sorry. She was very sorry, but she could not help. So Ruth did what she had always done when circumstances reduced her options to a single point. She waited, and she stayed calm, and she kept her mind clear. Stephen arrived the morning of the 3rd day. He came back from Wichita not in 5 days as planned but in 4, because something about leaving Ruth Keating in that place with those secrets had made the back of his neck prickle with an urgency he could not entirely explain and had not tried to. He had found Carver in Wichita, had spent an afternoon laying out the evidence with the copied documents Ruth had sent with him, and had watched the federal land agent's expression move from professional skepticism to genuine alarm as the picture resolved itself. Carver had asked for 2 days to review everything and contact his superior, and Stephen had given him 1.5. He rode back to Caldwell, feeling the particular anxiety of a man who has done what could be done from a distance, and now needs to close the remaining space between himself and the person he should not have left. He found the Cross property quiet in a way that was not peaceful. He found no one at the stables who would look him in the eye. He went to the office and found it occupied only by one of Harlan's hired men, who told him that the operations bookkeeper was indisposed and that Mr. Cross was not available. Stephen went to the main street and found the local sheriff, Tidwell, and spent 15 minutes carefully assessing the conversation, at the end of which he had confirmed his suspicion that Tidwell would not be a useful resource. He went to the hotel, where the proprietor, a man named Garrett who had been in Caldwell since the town was a cattle crossing with 2 buildings, told him in a low voice that people had noticed the Keating woman was not coming and going freely anymore, and that there was talk. "What kind of talk?" Stephen asked. "The kind," Garrett said carefully, "that involves Harlan Cross doing something that folks are not sure how to stop." Stephen thanked him and walked back out onto the main street and was standing there organizing his thoughts when the door of the Cross building opened, and Harlan Cross himself walked out with Ruth. She was bound at the wrists. Harlan had one hand on her arm and the other on the gun at his hip, and he was looking around the street with the calculating expression of a man who is deciding something. His 2 hired men came out behind him. Then Harlan saw Stephen Wallace, and Stephen saw Ruth, and the gun came up to her temple, which was where they had started. "Stephen Wallace," Harlan said, his voice carrying cleanly across the street in the cold morning air. "The surveyor. I heard you rode to Wichita." "I did," Stephen said. His gun was drawn and leveled, but he was acutely aware that his position was not good. Harlan had 2 armed men behind him. Stephen was alone on an open street. "Then you know that whatever you brought to Wichita," Harlan said, "is not going to be enough. Federal land agents move slowly. Courts move slower. Long before anything legal arrives in Caldwell, a great many things can change." "Including your circumstances," Stephen said. "When Agent Carver and 2 federal deputies arrive, which they will, because I left Wichita this morning and they left this morning also, by a different route." He was improvising on that last part. Carver had said he would come, had committed to it with genuine urgency, but the timing was uncertain. Stephen said it with complete conviction because the conviction was not entirely false and because he needed Harlan Cross to hesitate. Harlan's expression did not change, but something shifted behind it. He was calculating. That was the thing about him, Ruth had told Stephen. He was always calculating, and a man who is calculating can be reached by math. Even if that is true, Harlan said slowly, which I am not certain it is, I still have options that you do not. You have one option, Stephen said, and you are running out of time to use it correctly. Which is? To put that gun down and let her go, Stephen said. And to consider that whatever you have built can still be partially preserved, if you cooperate with what is coming, versus destroyed completely, along with your freedom, if you do not. Ruth had been watching Stephen's face this whole time. She had been watching the steadiness in it, the absolute refusal to be afraid, or rather the absolute refusal to let fear be the loudest thing in him. And she had been thinking clearly, which was what she did when she was most frightened, and she had been noting that one of Harlan's hired men, the one to the left, was not fully committed to this situation. She could read it in the set of his shoulders, the slightly sideways angle of his feet. He was a man who wanted to be elsewhere. She acted before she fully decided to. She dropped her weight suddenly and completely, pulling her bound wrists down and forcing Harlan to either hold her or hold the gun. And for one crucial half-second, his attention divided, and in that half-second 3 things happened. The uncommitted hired man took a step back rather than a step forward. Stephen crossed the distance between them at a run, and Ruth pulled herself free of Harlan's grip with the kind of desperate, focused strength that only becomes available when a person has decided absolutely that they will not be managed by fear. Harlan swung the gun toward Stephen. Stephen was already inside the distance where it was useful. What followed was brief and undignified, and entirely without the theatrical choreography that stories later tried to impose on it. There was a struggle for the gun that lasted approximately 4 seconds. Harlan was strong, but Stephen was younger and considerably more motivated. The gun discharged once, into the air, and then it was on the ground and Harlan Cross was on his knees in the dust of the Caldwell Main Street, and the second hired man, reading the situation correctly, had quietly set his own gun down and taken several steps back. Ruth stood 2 feet away with her bound wrists held out toward the blacksmith, who had come forward with the practical presence of mind to bring a knife, and who cut the rope with 2 efficient strokes. The whole thing had lasted perhaps 90 seconds from the moment Stephen pulled his revolver to the moment Harlan Cross was breathing hard in the dirt. Ruth looked at her freed hands. Then she looked at Stephen, who was breathing nearly as hard as Harlan and who had a cut on his cheekbone from something in the struggle, and who was looking at her with an expression that was equal parts relief, and something she could only describe as heartbreak and gladness combined, as though the last 4 days had done something to him that the 90 seconds of struggle had not. "You are safe," he said. "It came out rough." "I am," she said. And then she closed the distance between them in 3 steps and put her arms around him, and held on with the grip of someone who has been alone and frightened, and has reached the other side of it. And he held her back with the kind of care that men show when something matters too much to risk. They stayed like that for a moment, on the dusty main street of Caldwell, Kansas, while the town slowly came back to life around them. Federal Deputy Marshal Amos Carver arrived in Caldwell 2 days later with 2 deputies, and enough legal authority to make Harlan Cross's careful construction of the last several years come apart with the methodical inevitability of a dam that has been quietly undermined. The process was not instantaneous. Legal matters never were, in 1873 or in any other year. But Carver was a thorough man with a genuine sense of outrage about what the documents revealed, and the case he began building in that October week in Caldwell would eventually reach its conclusions. The fraudulent land claims were voided. The front companies were traced and dissolved. The ranchers and homesteaders who had been pressured into selling at false prices were given a mechanism for reclaiming what had been taken from them, a mechanism that worked imperfectly, as such things always did, but worked better than nothing. And the Keating property in Ohio, 300 acres of decent farmland with a farmhouse that Ruth had grown up in, was formally returned to its rightful owner. She received the legal notice 4 months later, in February of 1874, and she sat at the small table in the room she had taken at the Caldwell Hotel and held the paper in her hands for a long time. A great deal had changed in those 4 months. Stephen had not left Caldwell. He had intended to, initially. His surveying work was mobile by nature, and he had contracts in 2 other territories that were waiting for his attention, and the sensible, practical thing to do, once Ruth was safe and Carver had arrived and the immediate crisis had resolved itself, would have been to complete his business and move on. He had not been able to do it. He had framed it to himself, at first, as wanting to make sure Ruth was fully settled and that no remaining tendrils of the cross situation would reach her. This was true as far as it went. Harlan had 2 associates who had not been immediately apprehended, and until they were located, there was a theoretical concern. But Stephen was honest enough with himself to know, after about a week, that this was not the actual reason he was still in Caldwell. He was still in Caldwell because leaving meant putting a significant distance between himself and Ruth Keating, and he found that he was not capable of doing that with any equanimity. They had fallen into a new rhythm after the danger passed. The evening suppers continued. The conversation deepened. There was a new quality to the time they spent together, something that had been clarified by the crisis, as though the 4 days of her confinement and the morning on the main street had burned away whatever remaining reservation either of them had been maintaining, and left only the truth of what was between them. He told her about the years after the war, about Missouri, and the complicated grief of fighting for a cause you believed in while watching it tear apart the place you came from. About learning to survey land because it was work that required precision and patience, and took him into the open country where the air was clean, and the distances were real, and there was something honest in the measuring of things. About the ways in which 4 years of war had made him distrust, for a long time afterward, his own judgment about permanence, about the wisdom of building anything you could not carry. She told him about growing up on the Ohio farm with her father and Daniel and her mother, who had died when Ruth was 12. About teaching herself to manage the accounts because her father's health had been declining from the time she was 16, and someone had to understand the numbers. About what it had meant to spend 2 years fighting for something that should simply have been hers by right, and the particular exhaustion of being a woman who kept being told that her intelligence and her evidence and her work were admirable but ultimately insufficient, because the world had organized itself in a way that made sufficiency a condition she was not automatically granted. "I have been thinking," she told him one evening in December when the Kansas cold had settled in properly and the hotel dining room was warm with the wood stove and smelled of pine and coffee, "about what I will do now. The Ohio property," he said. "It should be mine by spring," she said. "The legal process is nearly complete. Carver's people have been very thorough." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I could go back, manage the farm or sell it and use the money for something else. I have options now that I did not have before." He was very still across the table. "What kind of something else?" he asked. She looked at him. She had rehearsed this conversation several times in her head, had arranged her thoughts about it the way she arranged a set of accounts, clearly and in order, and then she had considered that perhaps clarity and order were not, in this particular instance, the most honest mode of communication available. "I do not know," she said. "That rather depends on things I do not yet know." He set down his own cup. "Ruth," he said, "I am going to say something that I have been working up to for approximately 6 weeks, and I would like to say it plainly because I think you appreciate plainness." "I do," she said. "I love you," he said. "I have been aware of it for some time, and I have been trying to find the right moment, which I am beginning to think does not exist as a separate occasion, and so I am simply going to say it now, during supper, which is not a particularly dramatic setting, but is where we seem to have most of our important conversations." Ruth felt the warmth of it move through her like light through a window. "It is a perfectly adequate setting," she said. Her voice was steady, which cost her something because the steady voice was a habit she had built for difficult moments, and this was not a difficult moment. This was the opposite of a difficult moment, and she thought perhaps she did not need the armor right now. She let her voice soften. "I love you too, Stephen. I have for quite some time." He reached across the table and took her hand, the same way he had taken it on the street 2 months ago, and this time he did not simply hold it. He turned it over in both of his and looked at it for a moment. This hand that wrote accounts and copied evidence and pulled itself free from a dangerous man's grip. And then he looked up at her. "Will you marry me?" he said. "I recognize that I have not much to offer in material terms right now, beyond a surveying business that is currently interrupted and the genuine intention to build something permanent. But I am asking you because I do not want to spend whatever time is available to me not asking." She said yes without hesitating. Not because she had not thought about it. She had thought about very little else for several weeks, but because the thinking had already been done and the answer had been clear, and hesitating at the moment of decision when the decision was already made seemed like a waste of both their time. They were married in Caldwell in January of 1874, in the small church on the east side of town, on a Saturday morning when the sky was the particular shade of cold winter blue that Ruth would always associate afterward with the best kind of clarity. The ceremony was simple, as befitted two people who had few social connections in the town and no family present, though Agent Carver, who had become something like a friend in the intervening months, made the trip from Wichita to attend, and Garrett from the hotel stood witness, and Marta, the cook from the Cross establishment who had tried to help when she could and had never stopped feeling sorry that she could not do more, brought a cake that was better than the occasion technically required. Ruth wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had ordered from a dressmaker in Wichita, and her dark hair was pinned up with the small pearl combs that had been her mother's, and she stood beside Stephen Wallace in the cold January light and said the words that made the rest of her life hers to build. He was not a demonstrative man in public. He was careful and measured with most forms of expression. A quality she had come to understand was not coldness, but its opposite, a form of respect for the weight of things. But when the minister said they were married and Stephen turned to her, the expression on his face was so unguarded that she felt it in her bones. He kissed her once gently, and then leaned his forehead against hers for a moment, just a breath, and said very quietly only for her, "I am the luckiest man in Kansas." She laughed, which she had not expected to do at her own wedding, and the laugh was real and warm and entirely without pretense, and it was, she thought later, the perfect beginning. The legal notice about the Ohio property arrived 5 weeks later. Ruth sat with it at the table, and Stephen came in from the cold, stamping snow from his boots, and saw her holding the paper. He sat down across from her and waited. "It is mine," she said. Officially and completely, free and clear, she looked up at him. "I need to decide what to do with it." They had talked about this. They had talked about many things in the 5 weeks of their marriage, the kind of deep and ordinary and extraordinary conversations that happen between two people who have chosen each other with intention and are now working out the shape of a shared life. They had talked about where to live, about Stephen's surveying contracts, about what kind of future was possible and what form it should take. "What do you want to do?" Stephen asked. Ruth was quiet for a moment. "I do not want to go back to Ohio," she said. "I thought I might, but I have been thinking about it seriously, and the truth is that Ohio is the past. My father's land, Daniel's memory, the woman I was before I came west. I do not want to go back to that. I want to go forward." "Then sell it," he said simply. "Use the money to go forward." She nodded slowly. "There is land here," she said. "Good land south of town along the creek. I walked it last week when you were out at the Morrison survey. It is 320 acres, and the asking price is reasonable, and the soil is good, and there is water." He looked at her with his gray eyes and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You want to farm." "I want to build," she said. "I want to build something real on land that is ours in a place we have chosen." I am very good with numbers and you are very good with land, and between us I believe we could make something that lasts." She paused. "I know it is not what you have been doing. The surveying takes you places, and I know you said you preferred places." "I said I preferred places," he said. "I did not say I preferred to be alone in them." He reached across the table, his hand covering hers on top of the legal notice. "Show me the land." They walked it that afternoon, through ankle-deep snow that caught the afternoon light and made the Kansas plains look like something painted. Stephen walked every boundary, crouching occasionally to push his fingers into the frozen earth and read what it told him, and Ruth walked beside him and pointed out where she had imagined the house would sit, where the kitchen garden would go, which stand of cottonwoods along the creek could be used, and which should be left standing for windbreak and beauty. He asked good questions. He always asked good questions. About drainage and elevation and the direction of the prevailing wind, about whether the creek ran reliably through dry summers or whether it was seasonal. She knew the answers to some of them, had done her research in the methodical way that was native to her, and the ones she did not know they agreed to find out before they committed. They bought the land in March. They sold the Ohio property through a land agent in Cleveland, and the price it brought, reasonable Ohio farmland in a year when eastern land values were holding steady, was enough to purchase the Caldwell land and build, and to have something left over for the start of operations. Ruth had structured the Ohio sale herself, via correspondence, and had been careful and precise about it, and the transaction completed in May. By June they were building the house. Stephen was not a carpenter by training, but he had the mathematical precision of a man who understood structure, and he hired 2 carpenters from town and worked alongside them with the dedication of someone building something that was going to outlast him. Ruth kept the accounts of the construction, managed the orders of materials, and also did considerably more physical work than anyone involved had initially expected, because she was not a woman who watched things being built when she could be building them. They disagreed during those months of construction about several things, about where the windows should face, about the size of the front room versus the practical requirements of the kitchen, about whether to invest in a proper cookstove immediately or to make do with a simpler arrangement for the first season. These were real disagreements, sometimes heated, because both of them were people with strong opinions who had spent years operating independently and were still learning the specific collaboration of a shared life. But they resolved every disagreement. Not always by one person capitulating to the other, and not always by finding perfect middle ground, but by working through it with enough honesty and enough respect for each other that the resolution, whatever form it took, left no residue of resentment. Ruth had been afraid, coming into the marriage, that her strong opinions would be a source of constant friction. She had been told by various people over the years that she was difficult, that her directness was off-putting, that a woman who argued her position as thoroughly as she did would have trouble. What she discovered, living with Stephen, was that what those people had been telling her was not that she was difficult, but that they were easily threatened, and Stephen Wallace was not easily threatened. He liked that she was direct. He said so, more than once, with the plainness that was characteristic of him. He said that he had spent too much of his life around people who communicated indirectly, who said things around the edge of what they meant and left too much for inference, and that being with someone who said what they thought was a relief to him. The house was finished by August of 1874. It was a solid, well-built house with good windows and a proper kitchen, and a front room that ended up being the size Ruth had wanted, because Stephen had ultimately agreed that she was right about that particular point and was not even slightly resentful about conceding it. They moved in on a Saturday, carrying their modest collection of furniture and books and household goods from the hotel room they had been sharing, and Ruth stood in the middle of the front room of the first house she had ever truly owned and felt something so complete and so quiet that it took her a moment to identify it. It was peace. The specific peace of someone who has fought hard for a long time and has arrived at the place they were fighting toward. That winter, they began farming. Stephen's surveying work did not stop entirely. He continued to take contracts in the region when they presented themselves, because the income was useful, and because the work was genuinely his, a part of himself he was not required to abandon in order to have the life they were building together. Ruth managed the farm's finances with the same precision she had applied to Harlan Cross's ledgers, minus the discoveries of fraud, and the picture she kept was always accurate and always honest. They had help. A young man named Jonas, 19 years old and from a farming family in Indiana, who had come west looking for land of his own, and was willing to work for wages and experience while he saved toward that goal. And a woman named Cecilia, married to one of the town's tradesmen, who came twice a week to help with the household work and became, over the months, something close to a friend. The farm produced wheat and kept cattle. The cattle because the land and market conditions in Kansas favored it, and because they had learned, watching the cross operation, some things about what a cattle operation looked like when it was run honestly rather than as a front for other purposes. Ruth had opinions about the ethical treatment of the people who worked the land and the animals on it, opinions she expressed directly and that Stephen shared without needing to be persuaded, because they were self-evidently correct. In the spring of 1875, Ruth told Stephen she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen, early in the morning before Jonas arrived, over the first coffee of the day, in the same direct and straightforward way she told him most things. He set down his cup. He looked at her. He stood up and crossed the kitchen and held her face in both his hands very gently and kissed her forehead and her cheek and her mouth, and then he held her close and did not say anything for a long moment because he was a man who sometimes needed the feeling to be felt before it could be spoken. "Are you well?" he asked finally quietly into her hair. "I am very well," she said. "I am actually excellent." "Good," he said. "Good." He held her a little tighter. "I am going to be extremely interested to know this person," she laughed against his shoulder. "We have some time," she said. "I know," he said. "I intend to use it productively." He did. He built an addition to the house, a room off the main bedroom that would be the child's room, with a window that caught the morning light. Ruth sewed things, which she had never been particularly skilled at but was improving, and received instruction from Cecilia, who was patient and good-humored about the gap between Ruth's precision with numbers and her rather more variable precision with a needle. The baby was born in October of 1875, on a cold, bright morning not unlike the one on which Ruth and Stephen had been married. He was a boy, as solid and determined in his arrival as his mother had been in everything she had ever done, with a fuzz of dark hair and his father's gray eyes, and a voice that made its opinions immediately and loudly known. They named him Daniel Thomas Wallace, for Ruth's brother and for Stephen's father. Ruth held him in the afternoon light while the autumn wind moved through the cottonwoods by the creek, and she thought about all the things that had brought her here: the loss of her father, the years of fighting, Harlan Cross's trap, the torn letter and the 3-day ride and the gun at her temple, and the moment on the main street when Stephen Wallace had looked at her, and she had understood that someone was coming for her. She thought that grief and injustice and danger were real things that did real damage, and that she would not minimize them or pretend they had not happened. She thought that she had earned the life she was living, not alone. She had not done it alone, but not accidentally either, and that was something she could hold. She thought about her brother Daniel, who would have found all of this both deeply satisfying and endlessly amusing, and she sent him a thought through whatever distance separated the living from the dead, which was real and permanent, and something she had made peace with without pretending it was anything other than what it was. And then she looked at her son and held him more closely and listened to Stephen moving around in the kitchen, making the household run because she needed rest, practical and capable and entirely himself, and she thought that whatever she had been fighting toward had at its center something she had not known to name when she started. Not just justice, though justice mattered. Not just security, though security mattered. What she had been fighting toward was the chance to live her own life, fully and honestly, without apology and without diminishment. And she was living it. The following years brought growth in forms both expected and surprising. The farm expanded as Stephen acquired, through honest purchase and careful saving, additional acreage along the creek that gave them better water access and more reliable pasture. Ruth's accounting work extended beyond their own operation when it became known in Caldwell that she kept books that were accurate and clear, and several of the town's businesses began employing her on a contract basis to manage their financial records, an arrangement that suited her both financially and temperamentally, because she was a woman who needed her mind engaged and was not going to pretend otherwise. Harlan Cross's case concluded in the federal court in Wichita in 1875. He was convicted on 4 counts of land fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy, and sentenced to 8 years in the federal penitentiary. The conviction was not a perfect justice, partial justice being the kind most frequently available in the actual world, but it was real and documented, and it stood. Ruth testified by deposition, because traveling to Wichita with a newborn was impractical, and her deposition was, Agent Carver told her afterward in a letter, the most precisely organized piece of testimony he had encountered in 11 years of federal land work. She kept the letter. She kept it in the small wooden box with the deed to the Kansas property, and Daniel's last letter home from the war, and the legal notice about the Ohio land, and a handful of other documents that constituted the paper record of a life that had been, at its most essential, a refusal to be told what she was worth. Stephen found her reading the documents one evening, not all of them, just Carver's letter and the deed, sitting at the kitchen table after Daniel was asleep and the house was quiet. He sat down beside her close enough that their arms touched, and she showed him the letter. He read it and smiled, not a large smile. The specific quiet smile that was more genuinely his than any larger expression. "He is not wrong," Stephen said. "He is not," she agreed. He took her hand under the table. They sat in the lamplight with the Kansas night outside the windows and the small sounds of the house around them. "I have been thinking," Stephen said, "about a thing." "Tell me," she said. "I want to put your name on the deed," he said. "With mine, equal and co-titled, it should have been done from the beginning." She turned to look at him. "It is your name as much as mine," she said. "More in some ways. The money that bought this land was yours." "The money was ours," he said. "The life is ours." "The deed should say so." They went to the county land office the following week and had the deed amended to read both their names, joint and equal ownership. The clerk who processed the paperwork looked slightly uncertain about this, because it was not entirely common in Comanche County in 1876 for deeds to list a woman as equal owner rather than secondary party. But it was not illegal, and Stephen's expression left no ambiguity about whether this was optional. Ruth signed her name beside his in the land office, Ruth Keating Wallace, the full name she had been using since January of 1874, and intended to go on using, and the deed was recorded, and they walked out into the late spring afternoon, and Stephen bought them both coffee at the hotel dining room, in the same establishment where they had had their first supper and most of their important conversations. "To whatever comes next," Stephen said, lifting his cup. "To whatever comes next," Ruth said, and meant it completely. What came next was a daughter, born in the winter of 1877, dark-haired like her mother, and already in the first weeks of her life, possessed of an observant calm that seemed to catalog everything around her with patient thoroughness. They named her Clara Ann, and Daniel, who was 2.5 and deeply interested in this new development, examined her with the serious attention of a small person trying to understand a thing that does not fit any previous category. He reached out a careful finger and touched her hand, and she curled her tiny fingers around his, and the expression that crossed Daniel's face was, Ruth thought, one she would keep in memory her entire life. Pure astonishment, and something that might have been the first seed of what would grow into fierce, lifelong loyalty. Stephen stood in the doorway of Clara's room with his arms folded, watching his two children in the late winter light, and Ruth, from the bed where she was resting, watched him. The lines of his face were, she thought, different than they had been when she first looked up from her accounts and saw him in the doorway of the Cross office. Not older exactly, or not only older, fuller, more himself. As though the intervening years had settled something in him that had previously been unsettled, and the settling had left him larger and more peaceful than he had been. He turned and saw her watching him and came to sit on the edge of the bed, and she took his hand and they sat together looking at their daughter and their son and the good winter light coming through the window that Stephen had positioned to catch the morning, and the house around them that they had built together, and the land beyond the window that was theirs honestly and clearly by right and by work. "Stephen," she said. "Yes. I want to tell you something." "Tell me," he said. "I was not looking for any of this," she said. "I came to Kansas because I was running out of options and someone offered me a route forward. I was not looking for a home or a partner or love. I did not believe particularly that those things were available to me in the form that would actually fit who I am." He was listening in the complete way he always listened. "I was wrong about that," she said, "and I am very glad I was wrong." He brought her hand up and held it against his face for a moment. The simple intimacy of it was, as it always was with him, more direct and more genuine than anything elaborate could have been. "So am I," he said, "considerably." The years that followed were good years, not without difficulty, because no years are but solid and real and built on ground that was theirs. Drought came in the summer of 1879 and tested the farm hard, and they worked through it together, making the careful and sometimes painful choices that hard seasons required, and the farm came through with its essential structure intact. The cattle market shifted and adjusted, and they adjusted with it, because Ruth's numbers always told them the truth about where they were in time to do something about it, and Stephen's knowledge of the land kept them from making decisions that were locally comfortable but geographically unsound. Daniel grew into a boy of fierce energy and genuine curiosity, who wanted to understand how everything worked and asked questions with a thoroughness that Ruth recognized as native to him. Clara grew into a child of fewer words and deeper perception, who watched and cataloged and understood things before she said them, a quality that Stephen recognized as native to him, and that delighted him quietly and enormously. Jonas, who had been working the farm since the beginning, married a woman named Teresa in 1878, and acquired his own land 2 miles south, and he and Stephen maintained the easy friendship of men who respect each other's competence and do not need very many words to communicate it. Cecilia remained in their lives through the years, and her children and Ruth's children grew up in and out of each other's houses with the comfortable familiarity of people who have always simply been present. Agent Carver retired from the Federal Land Office in 1880 after 20 years of service, sent them a letter on the occasion of his retirement that ended with the line, "I have worked many cases in my career and resolved most of them to one degree or another, but the case that began with your visit, Mr. Wallace, and the extraordinary work of Mrs. Wallace, remains the one I think of most often as an example of what it looks like when people refuse to be defeated by a system that is working against them." Ruth read this out loud to Stephen at the kitchen table, and then folded it carefully and put it with the others in the wooden box. By 1881, the farm was the kind of operation that had a quiet, steady reputation in the county for being run fairly and run well. Ruth's bookkeeping business had grown to include 6 regular clients in Caldwell and 2 in a neighboring town, work she conducted from the house with the systematic efficiency that was simply how her mind organized itself. Stephen had completed enough surveying contracts in the region to be known as the most reliable survey man in that part of Kansas, and he took the work he chose and declined the work he did not. They had, between them, built exactly what they had set out to build. Not a life of great public drama or external achievement, though they had had their share of both. A life of substance and honesty, where the things they had were genuinely theirs and the people around them were genuinely known, where the words they said to each other were the real words, and the quiet of the house in the evenings was a comfortable quiet rather than an empty one. One evening in the autumn of 1881, 7 years after their marriage, they were sitting on the porch of the house in the late October light. The same kind of light as the morning of the incident on Caldwell's Main Street, that particular low-angled autumn gold that made everything it touched look permanent. Daniel was 8 years old and conducting some complex private enterprise in the yard that involved a wooden horse and several rocks arranged in significant patterns. Clara was 6 and sitting on the porch steps reading a book with the total absorption she brought to everything she found worth her attention. Ruth was doing accounts. She almost always had accounts in front of her when she sat down. It was simply the way her mind wanted to use its hands. Stephen was beside her, not doing anything in particular, which was something he did occasionally and without apology, sitting in the light and looking at the land and the sky. He reached over without looking and put his hand over hers, over the accounts just resting there. She looked up. He was looking at the yard, at Daniel and his horses and his rocks and his own small, complicated world. His face had the particular expression she had come to know as his most inward one, the expression of a man who is measuring the distance between where he expected to be and where he is. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He turned and looked at her, and the expression shifted into something more direct, the way it always did when he turned it toward her. "That I am entirely content," he said. "That I want you to know that." She set her pen down. "I know," she said. "I want you to know it too." Clara, without looking up from her book, said, "Could you both stop being so quiet about being happy? It is making it difficult to concentrate." Ruth and Stephen looked at each other, and they both laughed, the real and unguarded laughter of two people who have been through something together and come out on the other side of it into a life that keeps, reliably and with small daily variety, being better than they planned. Daniel looked up from his horses and rocks. "What is funny?" he demanded. "Everything," Ruth told him. "Everything is funny, my love. You will understand when you are older." He looked profoundly skeptical, which was his natural expression when adults said things that were clearly being used to avoid answering properly, and then returned to his horses with the practical dignity of someone who has better things to do than unravel adult mysteries. The evening moved around them in its slow autumn way. The light changed from gold to amber to the first faint deepening toward dark. A coyote began to call somewhere out on the plains, the same sound Ruth had heard on a Caldwell street in September of 1873, when a man she barely knew had told her she mattered to him and everything had shifted. Stephen's hand was still on hers. The accounts could wait. The house behind them was solid and warm and full of the evidence of a life built carefully, with love and precision, and the kind of honesty that does not require performance. The land beyond the porch stretched out in the last of the daylight, theirs in every way that mattered, paid for fairly and worked honestly, and growing more familiar with each season that passed over it. Ruth Keating Wallace set down her pen and looked at the light on the plains and at her husband and her children and the particular shape of the life she had made. And she thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that the best thing she had ever done had been the thing she had done when she refused to accept that she was out of options. She had come to Kansas running out of options. She had found evidence of a crime, and a federal agent willing to act on it, and a man willing to ride 3 days through a Kansas autumn because she mattered to him. She had found justice, imperfect but real, and land that was hers by every honest measure, and a marriage that was a genuine partnership between two people who told each other the truth. She had found a home. Stephen turned to her in the fading light, and his gray eyes were steady and warm and entirely present, and he said nothing, because nothing was required, and she leaned her head briefly against his shoulder and felt the solid, reliable reality of him and said nothing back. The coyote went quiet. The stars began to appear over the Kansas plains, brilliant and close and real, the same stars she had stood under in September of 1873 when everything had still been uncertain, and she had not yet known what was possible. She knew now. It was spread around her in every direction, and it was hers. Clara closed her book and came to lean against her mother's knee. Daniel abandoned his horses and rocks as the light failed and came to sit on the porch steps. And the four of them stayed there together in the first minutes of the Kansas night, comfortable and quiet and whole, while the world turned around them in its ancient and indifferent way, and the life they had built held itself solid and good against the dark. There was nothing more to fight for and nothing left undone. The land was theirs. The house was built. The people they loved were present. The past had been accounted for, and its injustices addressed as fully as the world permits, and the future stretched ahead in the form of seasons and work and ordinary days that would be. She knew, extraordinary in the only way that mattered. She picked up her pen. She finished the last column of accounts. The numbers resolved perfectly, as they always did when they were kept honestly. She put the pen down and held her husband's hand in the dark. Everything balanced.